3, 2, 1, and you're now live.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So the webinar is live. Although I don't have direct feedback, I assume that everybody is waiting for an interesting session on AI and regulation. AI and regulation, it's a parallel track, and we have 5, I think, extremely interesting contributions that will address the topic from various sides. Some housekeeping rules. We will, by default, everybody is muted during the session. What is relevant when you're using Zoom, Zoom also has a chat function, but not everybody has this available. So if you have questions, please use the Whova Q&A chat of the session. Then everybody can see it. For technical issues, Martina, who has been in contact with you probably already, could be contacted. A number of organization sponsors, which is, we are very thankful for that. And then, without much further ado, the agenda. I have a very short introduction and welcome. First, Gianluca Misuraka will tell us something about the future of AI in the public sector. Then Susanne Demel will talk about how to get regulatory frameworks right. Catharina talks about regulatory sandboxes. Anne Fleur van Veenstra will see how regulation can foster AI development, and Sonja has the industry perspective. And we expect to have these contributions in around 1 hour. The session is until 1:30, but if you have questions right after each contribution, please put them in the chat, and we will fit them into the time schedule. With some brief introductions of the speakers, Gianluca has been working for the JRC. He's now a consultant with the GFA group in Germany, but he has a good view on the application of AI in the public sector, and he will mainly look forward how that will evolve in the future, how we can design a bright future by doing sensible regulation of AI. Susanne represents an IT industry association, and she has a focus on AI. She was in the questionnaire group in the German parliament on AI, and so she will bring forward also the position of the industry as a whole. Catharina is working at KU Leuven in Belgium, and a main topic of research there is regulatory sandboxes, which is an interesting topic because for new technologies, you might want to test things out before you roll them out over all of Europe. Sonja is connected to both TU München and at the Corporate Technology Department of Siemens, and she is a long-time member of BDVA. So apart from the industry perspective, she will also be able to reflect on how things have been going on in the data and AI sector. And then my colleague Anne Fleur van Veenstra is a senior researcher at TNO, and her focus is on AI policy and how to understand the concept of responsible AI. A very brief background. The idea for this session came up when we were reading the consultation. The European Commission has put out a white paper on AI, where potential directions for AI regulation were addressed. And there was a consultation, and there were 1,200 contributions. That was quite a lot, because in parallel, the data strategy white paper was also put out, and that received considerably less contributions, of which there were 350 companies, 150 research organizations, but also 400 citizens. So we're actually onto a very important topic here. And as always, when the EC asks, should we do more on skills, or should we have more testing facilities? Should we pay attention to European data spaces, improve existing networks? Should we have a lighthouse research center? Well, especially the 4 first topics are topics that everybody agrees with, obviously. Should the EC do more? Yes. At least people who are filling in a questionnaire, a consultation, will always answer yes. But when you ask things about, do you think a new regulatory framework is needed for AI? Then 42% said yes, but 33% said, well, the current legislation framework can be modified. And 3% even said, well, we don't need any new legislation at all. And 22%, quite a high number, were undecided. And also the scope of regulation. Should we only regulate high-risk applications of AI? Well, 42% said yes, but 30% said, well, maybe you should also have legislation for non-high-risk applications. And 27% did not have an opinion. And also on high risk, initially you could think, well, the definition of high risk as the EC has proposed was endorsed by 59%, but only 37% of all respondents filled in that question. So basically, we do not know what a high risk AI application is. So while the consultation was pretty decided on a number of topics, there was quite some confusion and undecidedness on these topics that we see here now. So I hope and expect that some of the contributions today will help us to better understand these type of issues. So after this brief introduction, and I already used 2 minutes more than I had scheduled for myself, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, which is Gianluca Misuraka. Gianluca, you can share your screen.
Yes, thanks, Frick. And let me see. You should be able to see my slides.
Yes.
And so thanks for the invitation, first of all, and clearly, actually, just I mean, you mentioned about my new activities, but also I will be actually I'm here today more with my research hat. So as I also joined recently the Danube University in Krems, where I'm continuing somehow my research on digital governance and public sector innovation that I've been in fact leading, as you mentioned, for the JRC, for the European Commission Joint Research Center in Seville since 2009, actually until a couple of months ago. And so today I will in fact briefly say, hopefully set the stage and then for more informed and say a presentation on the topic of the regulation. But I will actually look more at the governance with, of, and by AI that is actually under debate at the moment, as Frick actually said. And one of the findings of the consultation that, of course, I'm particularly pleased is also the fact that public sector was considered very important by a large majority of the respondents, and that's why, in fact, we've been pushing, as I will show, on looking at the role of artificial intelligence in the public sector and for the public sector. So basically, I want to convey hopefully 3 main messages. One is a bit of results from the excursion into the future that we have been doing as part of a research project for the GRC, and then also as part of the AI Watch, the Commission Observatory for AI, also trying to understand some of the dilemmas and the paradoxes that we actually have when we face AI governance, and especially in the public sector. And then, as Frick already anticipated, I will somehow go back to the future and mentioning what I'm starting to do in the coming months. So first of all, just a bit of advertisement of a report that was published last month on exploring digital government transformation in the EU, or more precisely, the report and the investigation looked at how the governance of technology is changing and how the use of digital technology is innovating also the public sector. And also we just published a couple of weeks ago a policy brief on shaping digital government transformation at the Horizon 2040. And in fact, when we think about the future, it seems each time we have a new technology or supposed to be new, that a new paradigmatic shift is happening. And so, of course, we were waiting for AI, however is this defined, to change the world, especially so in the future. Actually, the industry is very much already into the singularity dream rhetoric, I would say, because it seems that this is coming very soon. But in reality, and the COVID pandemic actually brought to the fore also this controversy about the use of technology, because it doesn't look our socio-political systems are ready to really embrace this digital transformation and the impact of technology that, of course, is also accelerating, especially now in the current crisis, but is also showing many limitations. In particular, we see, and this is under the discussion at the moment, on the power of tech platforms, mainly from outside of Europe, how to regulate the digital world, and of course the issues of the potential positive or negative algocracy, if you want, that could have a strong impact also on our democratic systems. And so somehow we have two main dimensions of concern that are still there since many years and not necessarily new, but is who is actually who is going to govern this digital world, and what is the role of the states vis-a-vis the industry and also the citizens, and also exactly what is the level of individual data protection that is required. Again, this trade-off between privacy, security, and also individual freedom is vis-a-vis the collective good that is now emerging also, again, very much because of the outbreak of the COVID is coming to the fore. I mean, to say we did develop these scenarios started before. I mean, the research was done before the COVID, but then, of course, the scenario exercise actually was conducted during the lockdowns in Europe. And so some of these issues that were already there was further discussed among the experts that participated in our scenario. And we have two main theses on which we then built the design framework for the scenario, let's say, digital governance in Europe at 20 years from now. One is the topic of the digital geopolitics that clearly is very important at the moment, I mean, under the German presidency of the EU Council, but is also because the current Commission von der Leyen has put itself as a geopolitical commission. And clearly the topic of digital sovereignty is very much debated, the data protection, and also how the GDPR will evolve, and of course the 5G and somehow the dominance of the platforms we already mentioned. So how this European approach in AI and in data governance would actually guarantee or not the European digital leadership. The other, let's say, dimension of impact that could change the way the future will look like, clearly the fact that under uncertainty, and the COVID crisis further emphasized this issue, we have to manage without actually knowing what are the impact that will have certain decision in the future economy and society. So of course, on one side, there is who is more in favor of intervening and regulating to avoid exactly unknown risks, and this is very much the case for algorithmic governance, for instance, or machine learning and deep learning, let's say, decision making. And on the other side, I mean, building on the law of the fear of Carl Sunstein, that is not new, but clearly, if we want to avoid negative risk by using the precautionary principle, then somehow we could have further negative effects. So somehow we have to innovate also the way we govern so that we balance precautionary approaches with the cost benefit of certain decisions. So for this, we have basically developed a classical approach for scenarios where we have two main axes. One is the landscape for digital transformation. So exactly whether we have a more regulated or interventionist approach or an unregulated, so more laissez-faire approach. specifically to regulation, but not only that, is more what is the role of the state in steering or not such a digital transformation process. And the other, of course, is the way that the citizens, so the people will actually in the digital world act, rather being more passive as they are somehow today, despite GDPR that give us all the possibility to, for instance, accept or not certain cookies, but at the end we all do it in a kind of almost automatic way, or to a more active, let's say, approach where full data ownership and digital sovereignty, whatever it means, would be actually empowering the citizens. And somehow we have this fourth scenario, of course, that goes from a more status quo, that is where we are living today, a more apathy and closed innovation, almost a quasi-monopolistic digital landscape, where actually we could increase the digital divides and regulation would not be intervening. On the other side, we could have other scenario, more precaution and inclusion, but also fear, and where actually let's say what Shoshana Zuboff mentioned as surveillance capitalism could actually become a reality. Or instead, the more idealistic, let's say, scenario of open innovation and trust is where active citizenship, together with the makers of innovation, so the industry, for instance, would actually make sure that there is from the bottom up the emergence of a trusted, sovereign and decentralized data governance that would allow then the states to provide in partnership with all the stakeholders, human-centric services and AI. Now, coming to these, of course, we all know when we do foresight that the scenario is only a possible world, a world that does not have to pass, but may yet come to pass. So here today and in the coming months, the policymakers and those stakeholders involved in this debate will have let's say the hard work to make the choice that will impact our world in the future and our children and the children of our children. So coming to another topic very briefly, as I said, I've been leading the task of the iWatch on AI for the public sector, where we collected cases across Europe and beyond. And we somehow came up to, let's say, having a very functional and pragmatic approach of AI application. So without entering into the debate of the definition of AI, and we derived the typology actually from the over 200 cases that we collected. And for this, as I said, this report is available. I won't go into detail, but we saw that despite the hype and the rhetoric of AI, we see that the use of this kind of set of technology that has a strong potential when combined is actually, at least in the sample we have gathered and in the administration we have been looking at, still very simple. And so we also, in terms of technology, we see a lot of chatbots, and we don't really see the radical or disruptive change that this technology could actually instead have. And also looking at from another perspective, so in terms of the purpose of AI, we see that still there is some use of for internal management and regulatory, so decision support systems, but mainly it is to support services, and very little really use of AI to granting formal benefits or rights to citizens, for instance, where instead this will be very much of use. So I won't go into details of the work that we also been done to look at the strategies for AI in the public sector, where we, using a metaphor from public policy, we see that a lot of sermons, but very little carrot and stick, so very little yet regulatory intervention. And so just conclude with some issues that are open for the debate. So the high heterogeneity, the search for the holy grail of the best practice, and the need to go beyond the piloting, and the need to have more evidence to really understand how to define the strategies. And two very important points that the regulation aspect is the procurement, or the need to innovate use innovative public procurement for increasing AI adoption, and of course this issue that I mentioned at the beginning of how we govern with and of AI, but also how to deal with the governance by AI. And so just to conclude and to give, let's say, a snapshot of what I will be going to do in the future, provided that these are the three, let's say, recipe that we have to look at. I won't go much into detail of this. Is I mean, I'm starting now with as a team leader of a new project that will promote the development of an international alliance for human-centric approach to AI. So in support of the European Commission, it was already mentioned during the first day of this conference. So we could probably say in the future that we were born at the European Big Data Value Forum. And so this is somehow the ambitious and very, very challenging, but exciting work that I will be coordinating. And so I very much look forward to engage with all of you in these future activities. So I thank you, and of course I will be glad to further discuss later on. And sorry if I took also a couple of minutes more than expected.
Thank you very much, Gianluca, for laying the groundwork in this way, because you're outlining what dimensions are relevant when we are thinking about the future. And one interesting question was brought up in the chat, and the question is that how you see that the collective harm of AI that could be envisioned, that could become possible, how that could be addressed by personal data protection. Because the person who asked this question says that probably approaches like GDPR will not be enough to account for potential collective harm that is done by bad introductions of AI. So how do you see that?
Well, I mean, I won't enter into the details because, of course, this is also a political and sensitive topic. So my former colleagues of the Commission are dealing with this together with member states and the industry. So I won't enter into the discussion. I know there are, I mean, as we all know, there are some regulatory interventions. I mean, on the first day, the Deputy Director General of DigiConnect, Khalil Rouana, mentioned some of the legislative acts that that will be tabled soon, and so I won't enter into that. But maybe just, I mean, from a researcher perspective and a more philosophical, let's say, view, I've always been very much intrigued by the work of Niccolò Machiavelli, that you may know. And so I was rereading these recently for preparing a proposal for research, because I see that in this current pandemic society, actually, technology in general could really provide some risks to our, let's say, individual freedom, also, as I said, our democratic governance systems, at least in the democratic world, and actually reinforce the non-democratic approaches of others. So I'm an optimist still at the end of the day. So I say that as Machiavelli in his major work, The Prince, was envisaging that the collective work of citizens, of people, would be the essence of the republic. So I see that actually we could harness the power of technology to really have a collective approach to the common good, and this would of course require trust and trustworthy artificial intelligence, of course. So I would. I will use these without entering. I don't know if I really answered the question, but I'm sure that then the other speakers know probably much better than me what's happening in the decision-making rooms.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm sure that the person who asked the question will know how to contact you, because that is Tjerk Timam who asked this question. Maybe you already suspected that. Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gianluca.
Thank you.
Then the next presenter will be Susanne Demel of Bitkom, and she does not have slides, so if you see a black screen, that is intentionally. So Susanne, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you, Freek. Yeah, I don't have slides. I hope I can make myself understandable without them. You gave me a few questions beforehand, and I'm gonna go through those, trying to answer the big question that stands on this panel. Is there a need for a regulatory system for AI systems in Europe, and what will be the advantages and disadvantages of regulating AI systems? We have discussed the white paper of the EU Commission in depth within Bitkom, and also, of course, some of the ideas within the German Bundestag. I want to start with one very basic assumption, and that is, and has always been on our side, that in principle, legislation should not be based on one specific technology, but it should be technology neutral. So how does this go together with all the thoughts around AI regulation that we discuss all around Europe? I think we can explain the whole discussion partly because we have all understood by now that AI is a really powerful tool that we can use, and that it has the potential to very much influence our lives, and already does influence our lives today. And so there's a wish to give it a frame that that makes sure that we can still trust in certain processes, and that we can also exclude unwanted consequences that might arise out of the use of this new technology. So first of all, when we look at the regulatory system in Europe, we have to state that AI systems don't arrive in an empty space regulatory-wise. It's the other way around. They actually get into in a landscape where we have a number of specific regulations that would apply to such systems. We have horizontal legislation like GDPR, it was already mentioned, that governs a lot of the use of data. We have anti-discrimination laws. We have IT security laws. We have safety laws in place. We have a lot, and these are many of these are horizontal. And then we have sector-specific regulatory frameworks for automotive applications, in the medical sector, and many sectors that we have so far, even without AI, considered to be high-risk sectors, because if something went wrong there, there would be a risk for life and health of people. So how do we now properly assess what we need in addition to the existing regulation in order to react on maybe specific risks that arise from the use of AI systems? So this is really a tricky question, because I think it's interesting to see the white paper on artificial intelligence doesn't really define what AI systems are. It tries to define what a high risk is, and makes that from an kind of a sector-specific approach, together with the potential consequence that the use of an AI system might cause. And I think we really have to think whether AI is the right category or the right definition to define the scope of regulation that actually is there, or it might be created to regulate consequences of the use of AI. But do we really need AI as the scope defining definition? That's one thing I'd really like to discuss. Second, when we look on the thoughts that are already there on regulating AI and creating trust. We have to we have to think about how can we do this in a successful way. And I think an important factor is there is no such thing as the AI system. It very much depends on where you apply an AI system and to what purpose and in which context. So it makes sense to look at different sectors and the specific and typical risks that arise there, and ask yourself, do these risks change by introducing AI into these systems, and to what extent? And do we need other regulation than before to cover this? And I also think we have to differentiate between the risks for, like, physical risks for life and health of people, and then risks for fundamental rights like your privacy or the discrimination aspects that we have, because there might be different means of covering these risks and handling them. It was already the question that was there before. Yeah, data protection rules, I think, already regulate a lot of these privacy issues, but they might not help if a random group of people is suddenly treated in a certain way because the AI system has somehow identified them as a group by some maybe by some criteria that are not really logic, but for the system they were, so they are discriminated. We might have to adapt many of our laws at certain places, but I'm not sure that it'll help to put a whole new system just for AI over the whole framework that we already have. Maybe one other point is regulation is not only new laws, or regulation is not only legislation. That's what I wanted to say. But we have also technical regulation and certification as a traditional tool in order to actually bring more trust into systems. And I think in this context, it's very important to look at data as the basis for training and development of AI systems, to get high quality training data, and also what is important, data and record keeping, to keep a record on what data was used, and so that you can test and keep test data sets to see whether AI systems actually function properly or not. And I think the ethical considerations that play in the thoughts about regulating AI systems, that's also an underlying question in a way. I think many ethical aspects are already incorporated in the law. That doesn't mean that we automatically only produce ethical AI applications, or the outcome of AI application is always ethical. Why is that so? It's in the end, it's the concrete place and time where you use such an AI system, and where you decide that makes maybe things easier or quicker or more effective, where you have to decide whether it's adequate to use this system in this context, and whether it actually works well to an extent that is adequate to the risks that might arise from the use of this application. And I think the general broad debate that we have is good, to find out and assure ourselves that the values we hold still apply when we use new technologies. I don't think we really need new values. We just have to find out how we can actually secure our traditional values, and how we can use them to use the technology in a proper way. But in the end of the day, it's the person who decides to use a certain system in a certain place who has to consider these ethical considerations and to make a decision. So we cannot I think it would be nice if you could incorporate ethical aspects into the technology and then never have to think about it again. But I think that will never happen. We will always have to think about what we are about to do with the technology is actually ethical in the certain circumstances. So these are some of my thoughts on the topic. I'm happy to discuss any of these further with you all, and I hope that was enough roundup for the beginning.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you. So, did you fill in the consultation to the white paper? Because
yes,
maybe you don't need to answer, but maybe you were in the 3% that said, well, we don't need additional regulations, but maybe that is too quick of a conclusion there. But I think you underline there was already a small discussion in the chat with the previous session already, where Alyosha commented that it's funny that you have high-risk applications, but not high-risk technology. And he draws the parallel with buying a hammer, because the hammer is not a high-risk technology, but only when you use it to, for instance, to kill somebody, then it's high risk. And I think you were saying almost the same. Am I right in that, assuming that?
Yeah, I think the Commission actually that their thoughts go into that direction as well, because the application, the concrete application is to be looked at, because that only then you can say is that really risky or not.
Yeah. But then Tjerk in the chat takes this one step further, and he says that, well, if you use an automated procedure, for instance, to fire a warehouse worker in an Amazon warehouse, so when you have automated decisions, so whether or not, if you have used an AI system to do something that you would do otherwise manually, does that change the game, or is it essentially the same in your opinion?
That's an interesting question. If you use the same criteria to make the decision as a human or a machine, then it probably doesn't make a difference. The thing is, in either case, the person who is affected by the decision should have a possibility to actually get a feedback and an explanation why he's fired. But it's quite interesting. We recently did some research and asked people whether they would trust a human being more in human resources when deciding about an applicant, whether they would rather have a human being or rather trust a human being not to prejudice against anyone, or a machine. And humans were only, it was almost even. The trust in humans wasn't significantly higher than in machines.
Okay, so that's interesting. Well, that also refers back to one of my favorite topics, trust calibration. You shouldn't overtrust a machine, but you should also not undertrust a machine. That's
and not overtrust a human being, maybe.
That's a very good point that you're making there. Yeah. Okay. think the challenge is not to understand the ethical behavior itself. That's a complicated question. Is the challenge not to understand the ethical behavior within the AI system itself, which is not easily explainable? Yeah, so that links to the heart, the complexity of understanding why a system does as it does. I cannot immediately formulate a question out of the remark, which is quite complicated. Sorry, Paul, maybe you should interact directly on this topic, because I'm also looking at time and I think we need to move on. But I thank you very much for this very refreshing standpoint that you are taking here, which I'm sure will set many of the participants thinking. So thanks again, Susanne. Okay. And then we are ready to move on to Catharina, who is working at KU Leuven. And not surprisingly, for those of you who know the work of the specific group at KU Leuven, regulatory sandboxes is one of the topics that they are working on. So please, Catharina, introduce us into that topic.
Yeah, thank you, Fake. I hope that you see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, good. Actually, I feel a little bit frustrated that I need to talk and not continue to listen to all those interesting things that are said during this panel so far, but at least I'm going to do my job and continue listening. So let's talk about regulatory sandboxes a little bit. My slides are mostly like just to remind you what I'm talking about, not so informative. But yeah, so we hear a lot about regulatory sandboxes, especially here in Brussels. As a matter of fact, they seem to cause quite a hype among policymakers. It also seems that national governments are already on board, benefiting from the opportunities presented by this novel approach to regulation. Just actually a few weeks ago, the Norwegian government allocated some extra funds to the National Data Protection Authority, so they start working on establishing a regulatory sandbox focused on AI, as a matter of fact, which is actually following their AI strategy. But let's slow down a little bit before addressing how or if regulatory sandboxes are a good approach to AI regulation. I would like to just briefly sketch what exactly this tool is, so we are on the same page on this discussion. And well, the term regulatory sandbox sometimes creates confusion. It's a relatively new concept for law, even though sandboxes are widely used in computer science, of course. The first regulatory sandbox was created in 2014 by the UK Financial Conduct Authority through Project Innovate. So it was in the sphere of financial regulation. And in October 2017, actually, FCA published this regulatory sandbox lesson learned report, which assessed positively the result of the regulatory sandbox application. And this has led to kind of a tsunami of establishing a growing number of sandboxes under different financial jurisdictions around the world, and also attempting to transfer the use of this regulation to other sectors, such as data protection, for example. Granted that there is no universal definition of the term, regulatory sandboxes are essentially a testing ground of innovation products, services, and business models, where their potential risk is estimated and mitigated, but also where the relevant supervisor may provide certain leeway from the general rules for the purpose of the testing. The sandbox operates for a limited amount of time, usually several months to a year, and under certain test parameters, which allows predetermined number of participants. And in the interest of transparency and fairness, of course, the sandbox entry requirements need to be clearly defined and publicly available. There are other terms that are used to describe similar tools like living labs, innovation spaces, regulatory test beds, whatever. So yeah, do we need those things in general? Now, seeing those limitations of scale that you can determine from this explanation that I gave to what sandbox is, we ask ourselves if sandboxes are really needed and what was wrong with our previous approach to regulation. And in order to answer this question, maybe we need to go back a little bit to the first regulatory sandboxes and why they were created. As I already mentioned, the first operational ground was financial sphere. And why? Well, the financial sphere has always been very much affected and evolved with the evolution of technologies, often referred as fintech, which is basically new technologies aiming to automate and improve financial services and products. And you know, the financial crisis from 2008 was closely related to the deregulation of the financial sector. And the post-crisis approach was actually creating those sandboxes. While the technologies in the sector continue to develop rapidly, they, of course, brought new challenges and new risks. And in order to balance the risks and innovation, it was determined that the approach to regulation that we have currently is just not good enough. And we need something more dynamic and more future-oriented. Actually, Nesta Foundation, this is a UK-based NGO which is researching this topic as well. So they call this new type of regulation anticipatory regulation, and regulatory sandboxes are just one tool of many that regulators need to develop in order to address challenges of new technologies. Well, their potential was already recognized by EU on numerous occasions. For example, in the coordinated plan on AI, where the Commission envisioned regulatory sandboxes being used to test AI technologies in selected areas where the law provides regulatory authorities with sufficient leeway. But somehow they were omitted in the white paper, and basically the result is that the states are more active in taking advantage of the benefits that regulatory sandboxes offer. So what are those benefits? Well, I'll just maybe list some of the major ones. And first and foremost, a regulatory sandbox demonstrates the regulator's willingness to facilitate and stimulate innovation, which is a sign of good business opportunities in the respective state. On second place, it increases the level of knowledge for both participant and regulator. This enables regulators to better perform their functions and to gain vital insight on emerging technologies, making them less reliable to outside expertise. And furthermore, the time to market is reduced, which combined with the assurance that the new product or service have all the appropriate safety standards built in, or let's say it's some kind of a compliance by design. But a regulatory sandbox also allows innovators to have early warning about possible problematic features of their products and services, as well as assurance that they would not break any existing regulatory requirements during the test phase. As you see, those advantages could really be beneficial for regulating AI technologies. So, well, there are some issues that we need to address, but what are they exactly? First, there are some problems that are common to all regulatory sandboxes, regardless of which sphere they're deployed to, namely potential for regulatory arbitrage or race to the bottom. Such potential emerges in case of regulatory sandboxes if their design would allow for the disapplication of substantial regulatory standards and safeguards. Other risks include competition and level playing field concerns, which are related to preferential treatment granted to entities within a sandbox, especially when the entrance eligibility criteria are not sufficiently clear. But even if they are, the end result could be a certification-like effect that is defined, definitely not intended. The different national approaches also could lead to significant risk for the single market if they eventually result in divergent supervisory practices, which can impede the scaling up of innovative services and products across EU, and furthermore lead to a market fragmentation. The scale up of the regulatory tool is also not so good, especially compared to the price of deploying it, which is substantial. It is additionally limited to it's limited by the how to say it, like unclearness on how to establish multi-jurisdictional and multidisciplinary cooperation under the umbrella of one sandbox. Regarding some specific risks which are available when you use regulatory sandboxes to regulate AI, right next to the evolutionary problem with such system, we should put a lot of emphasis that up until now, what we had as example for regulatory sandbox were basically technologies of any kind, including AI-based products and services. So they are being tested through the sandbox designed by certain regulator, like a financial authority, data protection authority, etc., and predominantly for the risks that are under the mandate of this regulator in question. And if we have specific sandboxes for AI, however, this could mean let's say two scenarios. One, we end up with different product services that need to be tested but for numerous risks involving multiple regulators and sometimes even from more than one jurisdiction, which is lacking methodology and often legal ground. Or second, we establish a regulatory sandbox for AI in a specific area, let's say data protection. And then, well, the second option maybe sounds more reasonable, but when one would wonder if the added value of such exercise wouldn't be too little or even less compared to the costs. Even if we disregard the costs in the name of greater good, of improving the knowledge and competences of the regulator, we could face that companies might not be to incentivize to participate, and this is real risk here in Europe, where the leeway offered by the regulators is way too modest, especially compared to some other jurisdictions like Singapore, which offer much more liberal approach. And in all honesty, UK is the European jurisdiction that currently offers the best conditions for companies to participate in their sandboxes. And the more harmonized our national systems are, the harder it would be to offer something competitive, because even if national regulators want to lift some certain legal barriers, they cannot be able to, because those barriers could originate from EU law and they would not have the competence to do it. So now what? Shall we play in the sand? Well, deploying regulatory sandboxes in a meaningful and eventually useful way depends predominantly on political will, and especially on coordinated efforts on European level. As I already said, regulatory sandboxes are just a tool, and that is the tool that's still being developed. This means that we are testing the testing methodology, so to say, and this is good because we will be allowed to tailor it to our specific needs of this unique brand of trustworthy AI that made in Europe that we aim to develop. And in my opinion, there are some key components we need to align in order to successfully use regulatory sandboxes. In the first place, we need to address the uncertainty regarding whose mandate they're under and how to use them in greater scale that could fit the ambitions of the digital single market. Second place, we need to gather as much data as possible on the process and the result of the process in a given sandbox that we can share among jurisdictions and regulators. And this would require tremendous coordination effort. On third place, we should not forget that regulatory sandboxes are not a panacea, and they need to be complemented by traditional approaches to regulation, such as horizon scanning and other new tools, for example, like innovation hubs. Actually, innovation hubs be traditionally grouped with the regulatory sandboxes as innovation facilitators, and due to their better distribution and scale-up potential, their relationship with regulatory sandbox could be mutually beneficial and highly desirable. Because innovation hubs are basically the compelling first step to the innovative regulatory journey, and that could be used to promote, facilitate, or even coordinate participation in regulatory sandboxes for AI. And last but not least, we need to be sure that no matter what kind of incentives and benefits we offer and promote in regulatory sandboxes for AI, the technologies are still going to be tested and potentially approved in the temporary limit of several months or a year, and AI technologies could be cleared to access the market in certain cases, could continue to evolve and potentially become less compliant with time. And to ensure that such change could be predicted and the regulators can actually understand the whole life cycle of the AI system, regulatory sandboxes are probably not the best idea, at least not alone. So innovation hubs could be a better tool to rely on this particular scenario. To sum up, the balance between advantages and disadvantages of regulatory sandboxes for AI might not look very impressive, and I might be too negative. But nevertheless, the idea behind them is very sound and well justified. So I firmly believe if we are wise enough, we should be able to play in the sun. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarina. So that is a very packed presentation. There were many things to say.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, but you already answered one question. There was a question on how national regulatory sandboxes can improve European coordination on AI, because experience tells that there are many national differences, but you already gave an answer, like there are national differences, and this is something to address. So that is definitely something that might be seen as a disadvantage. There's also some chat messages addressing the link to digital innovation hubs, which is, I think, very interesting. But there's one very short question that may be quick to answer, and that is, are there examples of regulatory sandboxes that are really a paramount example, like, okay, this is where things went very well, or is it a concept that is still in the testing phase?
I would say that it's still in the testing phase because, as I mentioned, when we started utilizing regulatory sandboxes, that was in 2014, which was not that long ago, although it kind of seems like. But if I can give an example, maybe the one regulatory sandbox that we need to look at is the first one, because it still goes on. They're on their maybe 6th or 7th cohort, so 7th process, and this is the FCA, UK FCA's sandbox. And actually, it's quite fascinating if you go to their website and you can go through all the innovative products and services that they are tested, including some AI-based. And I would say that they're ahead of all of us, so we can definitely learn some lessons from there.
Okay, yeah. So that's really interesting. I think many participants, attendees today, would like to check up on that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And I would then like to invite Anne Fleur van Veenstra to the floor. Yes. Hello, Anne Fleur. Well, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Freek. I'm just sharing my screen and sharing my presentation. Well, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. It's always funny how this algorithm of these virtual backgrounds work better for some than for others, because I can now see that the blue screen is going through. Continue talking. I think we're sort of used to it now. And I'm presenting today on behalf also of my colleague Tjerk Timon, who I think already had some interesting contributions in the chat, so is here with us too. I would also really like to thank the previous speakers for their excellent and very thought-provoking presentations. And I think actually a lot of the elements that are already presented will also come back in our presentation, but from a slightly different viewpoint. So perhaps that's food for the discussion. So at TNO, we do a lot of research, both supporting policymakers on the questions they have related to how do you regulate digitalization or different technologies, of which AI is one of them. And at the same time, we do a lot of experiments in order to better understand how does the use of these technologies play out in practice. And from both of these fields of work, we came up with a question of how do you actually regulate AI or these technologies beyond what is already happening. We see a tremendous work being done by many brilliant thinkers, both on the European level, but also on national levels for different sectors, for different types of applications, on coming up with all these very precise and well thought ethical frameworks, including many values and lots of things, and basically setting out the challenges that everyone has when they want to apply these things. And we thought, well, there's so much going on in this field. And will this solve all the challenges that we identify in our work? Or do we actually need more? So that's why we came up with the question, how do you regulate AI beyond all the ethical frameworks that are being developed? So just to recap, what are some of the main challenges out there? I think it's already been mentioned that the use of algorithm and AI may enforce different biases that exist, often already in the data, or by the way, the algorithms perform the data analytics. There is also a question of which data do you select to train your algorithm on, or to use as input for any algorithm, where to place cutoff values, what to include or what not to include, because it may mean a lot for the outcomes of the analysis. And then there's also the question of presentation, representation. How are the outcomes of using these models and algorithms used? For instance, in the public sector, but also to make decisions on individuals and the impact of their lives. Are they seen as objective, as a sort of computer says no? Or do we look at them critically? How do we interact with these systems? And then there's the question of who develops the technology, whose algorithm will we use, and who can access them, and who can understand what is happening there. And at the same time, through our work, we see that there are new challenges that emerge. How do we explain the chain of decisions throughout their deployment? Can we track how decisions are made on which data, not only which data to include, or which analytics or which algorithm to use, but also in all the steps in between? And as well, with all what will happen with the data? How will we present it? Or how do we make decisions based on that? And in this whole chain of actions, of interactions with the system, small decisions are being made, and how do they impact the outcome of such a system? There is, of course, also all these analyses are not only using data, historical data or other data sources, but they're also generating a lot of new data that can in turn be used as a basis for decisions. But what does that mean? So how do we come from the original data sets that are being inputted by the creation of new ones? What does come out of that? How do these data sets that are being used, what biases are in there? What omissions do they have? How representative are they? So this is also a challenge that we may not always know yet. And then, of course, as said before, how do we interpret the outcomes? How do we use them? How do we interact with them? How do we consider their representativeness? How is it possible to come back on a decision? Or how can people still make complaints? And do they still understand? So these are new challenges that we found that came out of these newer technologies. So one of the things that we did is we selected 16 quite prominent ethical frameworks and see how they present principles on how to treat AI. Well, some first findings that we came up from this comparison is that a lot of these sectoral frameworks, so for instance, that emerge from a single sector, they try to be generic and present the findings as whether they may also apply to other sectors. Whereas in fact, there may be large differences between, based on historic development of certain sectors. For instance, in the medical field, we see that decisions, ethical decisions are often being taken by ethical committees. This is a very standard practice that is used for a lot of research type of activities, and that is now including also decisions on which data to use and which technologies to use for data analysis. Whereas in other fields, we see that very different practices are in place. So it's a question of whether a sectoral framework could apply also to other sectors, or whether differences emerge. We also notice that accountability is often an afterthought, by which we mean that the analysis and all the work is often already done and it's presented as if it will happen. And then in the end, we think about how to present the findings and how to explain them, but it's not often taken into account from the beginning of applying data analytics. The typology of harms is often missing, and why is it even necessary? But I think it has to do with the discussion that you just mentioned, Freek and Suzanne, on that there is now the introduction of these high impact applications, and whether that's even possible to distinct. And I think the discussion you just had sums it up very nicely. Very low-tech solutions may have a real and profound impact on individuals. Just a combination of two data sets, for instance, by very traditional statistics, which we probably wouldn't consider as high impact, may have a very profound outcome for individuals when it concerns their direct living environment, or whether it determines whether they are eligible for a certain benefit. So we may need different types of typologies, but which are useful and which is helpful. I think that is still something that these frameworks are sometimes conflicting, or at least not always in accordance with each other. And then there's the treatment of the word of ethics. Ethics is something that is out there all around us, and that actually still applies to us when we're cooking or when we're talking to our neighbor. Whereas the law or policy often have a more specific or a more applied sound to them. So doing ethics is always very complicated. Of course, applying the law and making policy are also very complex things. But they have a more applied and approved and a more procedural way of doing so. Whereas ethics is something that we may account or not account for all the time. And then we also saw that the mapping of all these ethical principles on different elements of the digital service or of the life cycle may play out very differently. And that is the circle that we presented on these slides. We try to see how these different frameworks interact at the different stages of applying AI. So in the design and development phase, upon implementation, but also when it concerns redress or mitigation of harms that are being done, for instance, by filing a complaint. So these are some elements that may point at things that need to be solved after these beautifully crafted and often very, very well thought ethical frameworks are adopted or installed or applied and used. So what other viewpoints are there beyond these ethical frameworks? How is ethics, how is it imprinted into policy and into practice? And how do we shape the trustworthiness of these systems? There are different viewpoints. So one of them is to take a rather technical approach and look at standardization and certification, for instance, and sort of rubber stamp approve, well, this algorithm or this system is trustworthy. And for instance, one of the things we see now is that a lot of people say, well, if we publish our algorithm if we show its workings, will that then be enough? Then, of course, there's a social perspective. Can we educate people? Can we perhaps involve them in the development of these systems? And can we have them encounter the inner workings for them to start to understand and thereby perhaps trust them. And of course, this links very strongly also to the case that many politicians are making of, or educational institutes of teaching children how to program at a young age. Then there's the legal perspective, which is already very lengthily been outlined, and that indeed often comes up with the viewpoint that no new laws, at least, are necessary, that all the current regulations and frameworks in place, that they're pretty well thought, and they should be able to regulate and come out with these with potential, and they should be able to mitigate potential harms. However, what is often difficult is that it may happen only after the harm has been done. In the case of a court case, after a system has already in place its bias and the implications to individuals are already done, of course you would like to ensure that this happens much before then. Then there's a political view. Who should be allowed to develop what? There's even a geopolitical element, of course, as we don't need to remind everyone. And there's the ecological. So who do we include, and which data availability is there? So we build on top of a system that's already out there. Freek, I see you entering the discussion. Would you like to?
Well, I'm looking at the clock.
Yeah, I was imagining so.
Okay.
What I can briefly do is I have two more slides which point out two directions that we think are very important, but I can mention them only very briefly because I think this is the main part of our.
Yes. Yeah, okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes, please.
So two things we especially would like to focus on is one, how to engage citizens and individuals in the development of these systems. And where, of course, there's also the question, who may co-develop and how? So who is able to develop and how can we democratize somehow the development of these systems? And the second one is, how do you do institutional oversight? So if we consider that current regulation that is in place is complete as it is, and the ethical frameworks are very well thought and being used in practice, how do you then perform oversight and making sure that it is being enforced in the way as envisioned? So these for us are two very important ways forward, and thank you very much for allowing me to present.
Okay, yeah. So thank you very much, Anna Fleur, and I think especially the assessment of the ethical frameworks, which are popping up like mushrooms, it seems sometimes. I found these conclusions quite intriguing, what they are addressing, but also what they're not addressing. And I think the two ways forward, as you mentioned at the end, are really indeed topics that are found elsewhere in this conference as well. So I think you're on the right track with these directions. I do not see immediate questions from the, oh yes, AI can be used to embedded systems. Oh, it's a very broad question by Jean-Christophe, who's saying maybe we should step back and understand the threats that should be addressed. AI can be used for everything. And is it feasible to think of a one-size-fits-all solution for AI regulation? And he's saying, well, probably it will not work, will it? So he's already expecting the answer. What is your opinion on how generic an approach can be?
Well, to me, it's not so much a question of how generic it can be, because I think there will always be very generic principles, and they will always have their applied elements too. Mm-hmm. As is the case with legal regulation, or with sort of common practices that are being developed. I think for us, what we came out, what we found in this comparison is that you really need a full landscape.
Mm-hmm.
You may have generic principles, you may have sectoral agreements,
Mm-hmm.
all these elements. So it's not a question of either or, but you basically need development, you need oversight, you need regulation, you need policy, and there needs to be good and sufficient balancing and interaction between all these. And you can't skip them.
Okay. Yeah. We would already expect that a one size fits all approach wouldn't be necessary, wouldn't be enough, but you are underlining that. Okay. Thanks a lot, Anne Fleur. And then we are entering the last 15 minutes of this interesting session, and that will be Sonja Zillner, who was already unmuting, switching on the camera. Sonja, you're able to reflect on 4 extremely interesting contributions so far, and you also had prepared your own materials. So it is your challenge to try to link those.
I have to say, this is now a really difficult one. Thank you, Frick, for introducing me, and thank you also for inviting me to this panel. I mean, I think this is now a really difficult one because we have heard so many important positions already, and I think most of them will be repeated in my presentation. But I would like to give you a kind of a other angle on top of this. So basically, I would like to talk about trustworthy AI in industry. So more or less like assuming the fact that we will have some regulation, and I have to say that, I mean, it will be of important that there's people perceiving risk by AI, and this is a new technology that might impose risk. So we need to find a way to ensure that that this will not happen, right? So basically, I think regulation, there will be areas where we need it, and I think it will also help us a lot in order to ensure trust for AI. So, but how can this be done in an efficient manner? And I mean, legislation, now I'm repeating what Suzanne was saying, legislation should be technology neutral, right? And we already have a lot of stuff in terms of regulation available, GDPR, safety, non-discriminatory law. So basically, how to tackle this situation. What I would like to give here is first talk about characteristics of industrial AI, because this is the area where I'm coming from and what I'm concerned about, and to share with you how we are thinking about it. It's the first thing is that we have like industrial AI applications. Usually they are quite complex. We have different technologies involved. We might hear this as an example of maintenance and inspections. We have those systems needs to be safety. They have already a lot of Kpis involved. So basically we have in terms of what we are doing, I mean, the machine data is very context dependent. We focus on optimization of processes. If you have human interaction, usually this is in the role of a professional person. So basically for that reason, the interaction, usually we can define processes around it. And we have contractual agreement between B2B partners. So basically also some kind of legislation is here in place. But what I think the most important thing is that we have already requirements and legislation in place. And when we come up with new AI regulation, we need to ensure that this is complementary, right? So basically that we are not overdoing and not underdoing here. So having said this, let us look at the trustworthy AI requirements. I mean, this is nothing new. These are the HLAC guidelines for trustworthy AI. You can translate them in terms of these are requirements that needs to be addressed. Yeah. So basically, let's have a look at the technical robustness and safety. So basically, because this is very central for industrial AI systems, systems needs to be robust, industrial systems needs to be safe. This is nothing new, right? This is since ever we need to ensure that no harm is happening. So how is this defined? I mean, there are different areas, and I'm only touching now the surface, and I will not start this video. What I would like to convey with this slide is that different categories where we are observing or where we can perceive risk. This is on the one side here. On the left side, you see that there would be an adversarial attack. So somebody would sneak into a Tesla, and then the car is going to the wrong lane. So basically, this is something we want to avoid. But we also have it in a way, you see this picture here. This is an algorithm who aims to identify a person when there's a person, right? And you see on the right, the person is nicely identified, but whenever a person puts on some other image, then the algorithm is not able anymore to identify the person. So basically, there are these typical examples. I think we have it around quite in many areas. So you have like small additional information added to the algorithm, and then suddenly the algorithm is no longer doing what you want the algorithm to do. So basically, how to avoid such wrong behavior. So basically, you have an objective, but it's not doing what you want to do. So basically, this needs usage risk. We need to find ways to overcome this. So basically, then I go back further to the, let's see, to how to define, or what, when we look at the age-lag report, I mean, it's like including several aspects in terms of technical robustness and safety. And here we have like aspects of accuracy, that the model should be as good as necessary. It needs to be reliable. So it should be work when you give the same inputs, then what it is produced should be in a range which is expected, and reproducibility. If you repeat it, it should also be do the same. So basically, what we're having here is some type of requirements here, more detailed, right? But how? So I'm asking myself, how can I implement it? So what are the implications if you now go to concrete conformity assessment, to concrete legislation? So how could this work? So if you go one step further. So what I did ask myself, how is safety defined? So how could you define this? And so now you're following me a journey through all these documents. So basically what I did, looked at all these landscapes, standardizing landscape. Don't be surprised. I only want to indicate that I will look at this ISO SC42. It's an international standards, and I think this one is the right one to look at, because I'm concerned about technical features, and technical features might be good to be defined on an international level. I mean, if you talk about ethics, then I think it's good to be on a more regional, like European level, because we might have different, value principles, but technical systems should be always defined on international level. So let's have a look at this standard. Here you see copy-paste safety aspects. So how is safety defined? I mean, safety, what the standards are saying, is achieved by reducing risk to a tolerable level. So basically there's a level and you need to reduce potential risk, right? So the complete life cycle of an AI system becomes subject of consideration. So you cannot say, now I have defined it or developed it, now I have it. So you have to address the complete life cycle. So is this possible if the system is changing again? So how can you assess, validate it? Difficult one. And last but not least, for a specific system, not only the AI part, but all used technologies and their interaction are subject of consideration. So basically, I cannot only assess one AI technology, I always have to see it in the complex system. So basically also, how can we ensure, what techniques do we need to have in order to address this? So these are the first thoughts. Then let's look at the risk management. So here also the standard is saying something. Basically, risk, according to another standard, is defined as effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what does it say? I want a machine to do something, and there is an uncertainty that this will happen, right? So basically, I have an intention of an industrial system that it should do A or B in this type of quality, but risk is involved if I'm not certain that this can be accomplished. And then how we are handling risk, basically for each we can identify control objectives. So basically objectives that are of relevance, that they are called control objectives. And for all these control objectives, so all these aspects I would like a machine to achieve, right? I need to identify a set of possible controls that I then can use to mitigate the risk. So basically, at the end of the day, in order to come further with handling the risk, I would need to have all these controls that observe that behavior I would like to achieve. right? So basically now we are at this part, and now I'm asking myself how to translate risk into controls. So ways to mitigate risk. So basically at the end of the day, I identify maybe a risk, like an uncertain behavior, or like a behavior that is not intended as it should be. And now the question is, how can I introduce controls that mitigate the risk? So here also some aspects, what are possible mitigations or controls are. You see that these are, I mean, it's like these could be new ways for security, new ways for privacy, consideration to related robustness, resilience, consideration related to data. So basically, these are possible things I can do in order to avoid risk. But still, I do not know, I cannot measure, right? It's no way forward to measure this. I do not have any means to assess it. And then how could you, at the end of this, if you would have an AI legislation, how would you know, how could you verify that you have it? So basically, for that reason, I try to find more way how in the different sectors this is done. So basically, I ask myself how to measure controls, right? And here now, I'm looking at the safety for autonomous driving. So this is a document which was written by experts in automated driving, and they are looking at how to ensure that safety can be fulfilled. And basically, what they see as challenge here is the validation of a subsystem that are based on machine learning. So basically, they have many challenges that need to be addressed in order to ensure that automated driving is fulfilled. And challenge 5 is 1 out of 5. And they need to ensure that the subsystem, that machine learning system is doing what it wants to do. And this is now a document I found, and I'm not stating that I have the overview of all, but here it's a document where they are really like defining measurable and reachable KPIs. And I thought that's quite interesting. So basically now, but the KPIs do not have numbers in place, but they give more an indication that you could, for example, I'm looking here now at the KPIs that they would like to measure. So they could be performance of an, this is a DNN is an operation for the neural network. So basically deep neural network. So the performance, they could measure the robustness, they can measure the understandability, the resulting DNA-based software components. So basically here are some first KPIs that are defined. However, it's still now the question how they are measured. Are they measured on a quantitative manner? Are they measured on a qualitative manner? So basically here this document ends. So basically for my understanding, this is really like an open research questions that we have on the one side, we are putting forward, we are discussing that AI regulation could or should be in place, right? But then at the end of the day, in order to verifying and testing and improving that regulation is fulfilled, we simply lack standards, definitions, and also technologies. So for that reason, I would like, I'm seeing Freak is already like there in order to indicate that we are reaching the end of the session. But actually, I would like to have like one summary slide in order to convey my messages. I think there will be some AI regulation or AI-related regulation will be in place, and I think it's good to identify the right areas which are high risk and on an application level, and it will help to increase trust of people. So in order to move forward here, trustworthy AI requirements, I think, are a very important way forward to scope the areas of action, right? So a lot of stuff needs to be done. If you think forward for conformity assessment, as I said before, this should be on application level and reflect the risk involved. If there's no risk, I think we are happy and we can move forward as without any assessment. What is currently missing is techniques for verification and validation. So basically, it's like if you would like to put some requirements forward, we need to make sure that we are able to verify and validate them. This is a complex task, and I think more research needs to be done in this area. And in addition, finally, I think we also need to have additional research in AI to establish the basis for fulfilling the identified controls, right? Because we are now requiring the technology to fulfill particular aspects and avoid the risk, and more research is needed in this area. Freak, thanks.
Yeah.
Hope I'm in time.
You're exactly on time, Sonia. And I know that you asked to be the last because initially I had a different order in the agenda, but I think you gave an extremely nice elaboration of the last point that Anna Fleur introduced on how to assess and audit AI, because I think that was your main point. If you want to do anything meaningful in practice, we need these verification and validation methods. So that worked out beautifully. Yeah. Yes, and unfortunately it is 1:30, and that means that our host has to go to another meeting. So unfortunately, a full wide discussion of this topic, we don't have time for it. But I think and I expect that the debate around regulation in AI will continue. But I think this session has given some quite interesting angles and viewpoints, ranging from maybe we don't need regulation at all additional because there's many things in place, to regular sandboxes, but also looking forward to which dimensions you need for a future to be drafted. And we looked at ways to assess and audit AI and what works and remains to be done there. So I think we've charted the territory. There were some answers, but as always in innovation and research, there's many more questions. With that, yes, that was also concluded in the chat. Sorry, Tjerk, there's no more discussion. Sorry for that. So we're tight in time, but I would really like to thank all of the contributors. And only this morning, I thought I need to buy a box that emits a huge roaring applause. Because I cannot do that on my own, but let me give you a virtual applause from almost 100 people. Thank you for now, and maybe we see you in another session. Thanks a lot, and see you later.
Yeah.
Freak, you have the close button on your screen because I made you host, so you can close the call.
Okay. Thank you, Martina. Okay, then the session goes clap, clap, clap. Thank you, Jean-Christophe.